Kiana, and today I will be talking about the Mayan people of Guatemala. Guatemala was colonized by Pedro de Alvarado in 1523, and there was an estimated 2 million Mayan people inhabiting Guatemala. Spanish people brought with them many diseases, including smallpox, measles, typhus, and plague. The intrusion of the Spanish caused warfare, exploitation, slavery, forced migration, and resettlement for the Mayan people. In the first 50 years of the Spanish rule, there was already starting to be an erosion of Mayan people and culture and a decrease in the Mayan population. Today, Indigenous people are a minority and make up 40% of the population. In 1954, the United States Central Intelligence Agency performed an overthrow of the President Jacobo Arbenz. Jacobo Arbenz was elected by the people of Guatemala and was conducting land reforms, giving land back to the indigenous people and trying to bring the poor up. The overthrow of Arbenz ended the Guatemalan Revolution that took place from 1944 to 1954. The reason that the United States overthrew Jacobo was because he was soft on communism, and the United States had their United Fruit Company in Guatemala that gave them indirect political control of Guatemala. They were using that to harvest capitalism, imperialism, and a hegemony. They didn't want to lose their hegemony, so that's why they overthrew Arbenz. The CIA replaced Arbenz with a military dictator named Carlos Castillo Armas. This new president robbed poor Guatemalans of their rights to vote, not letting illiterate Guatemalans vote, and he canceled the new agrarian reform that Arbenz was working on. So the land that the indigenous people were just given back, he took back away. So this created a rebellion in 1960, and Castillo was killed, and that was the same year that the 36-year Guatemalan Civil War began. During the Civil War, around 200,000 people were killed, 83% of them being Mayan. And there were 50,000 that disappeared. Many fled through the mountains and jungles into southern Mexico and stayed in refugee camps. In 1982, General Rios Montt gained power through the military, and his time in power is referred to as the Guatemalan Genocide and La Violencia because it was the most violent time during the Civil War. And it was more of a genocide than a war because it was the military attacking civilians. His military regime carried out widespread massacres, rapes, and torture against the indigenous population. They used something called the Guns and Beans campaign to try to gain control of guerrilla groups. So if people would join his military, he would feed them, and if they didn't, then he would kill them. This counterinsurgency caused Guatemalans to fight against their own people to avoid being killed. The government-based militias acted as death squads and dumped piles of dead bodies on street corners to instill fear in the population, saying that if you showed sympathy toward guerrilla groups, or if you weren't with them, or if you acted against state interest, then that could be you. Rios Montt's immunity ended in 2012, and he was indicted for genocide and crimes against humanity. So this is some of the history of how Guatemala came to be the place it is now. So this here is a picture of General Rios Montt, the military leader that led during the time of the Guatemalan Genocide, the most violent time. Here you can see that people protesting against him compared him to Hitler, which is a fair comparison. And here is just a picture of some of the damage that was done during the Civil War. Guatemala still has high levels of violence today and has a weak and corrupt law enforcement. 60% of the population now lives in poverty. There are high levels of crime and violence and systems of racism and inequality. The indigenous peoples make up a big portion of the population experiencing poverty. Schools do not offer classes in indigenous languages, so indigenous children that grow up in homes that speak their indigenous languages often struggle a lot in school. There are now classes to learn an indigenous language, but there aren't classes for people who speak that indigenous language. For example, it would be like taking a Cree class in school, but not having all of your classes provided in Cree. So there are high dropout rates, and many children do not make it past elementary school, especially Indigenous girls in rural areas, since the majority, if they can only afford to send one child to school, will choose the boy. And here are some statistics about education in Guatemala. Only 3 in 10 kids graduate the 6th grade, and the nation's illiteracy percent is 25%. The indigenous population's illiteracy percent is 60%. So you can tell that there's a big difference with indigenous people. And an inequality there. Indigenous families often don't have the money to afford transportation and books and school supplies, or access to internet and computers. Time in school also takes away from the time that could be spent working to sustain the family, so children are often pressured not to go to school so they can help the family make money by working on the farm or selling things they make or whatever. When I was in Guatemala, I learned about an organization called Anadesa and spent a few days there learning about it. It was an after-school program that helped Indigenous children with their homework. So the people that worked there spoke Indigenous language of the area and Spanish, so they could help like translate and So some of the things that Indigenous people want, that they want to change in Guatemala, is they want identification of the people who disappeared or were killed in the Civil War, prosecution of those who committed the crimes in the Civil War, the right to teach, publish, and deal with the government in Indigenous languages, less discriminatory police services, greater political rights in their own communities, access to justice, including their right to administer Indigenous justice, and greater participation in central state decision-making. In judicial proceedings, many Mayan people are still tried in Spanish, even if they don't speak Spanish, because there is a shortage of bilingual judges and interpreters. So it is very hard for Mayan people to get jobs other than farming or selling artwork, beading, weaving, etc. But it is always easier to get a job if they speak Spanish. So this picture here is of a man carrying firewood, and when I was in Guatemala I saw this a lot. So very like hard labor on the body, and because it was hard for them to get other jobs when they didn't speak Spanish, and there's just that like inequality for Indigenous people living in rural areas. There's not many options for things that they can do, so they're forced to do that kind of work. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about Mayan culture. So Mayan people, typically in the Western Highlands, have folk saints. One of the most popular folk saints is Mashimon, and here's a picture of him. He loves liquor and cigars, and he is thought to represent Pedro de Alvarado or Judas from the Bible. Modern-day Mayans are often Catholic converts, but still hold on to these folk saints. People often put cigarettes and bottles of alcohol by his statues to pay tribute, rather than putting flowers. Combining Catholicism and traditional Mayan spirituality is common in the Highlands. I once went to a Catholic church in Santiago Atitlan, where the priest condemned the people who had statues of Mashimon in their houses, and told them to go and burn them. This church was made up almost completely of Mayan people, and you could tell by their dress. Here is kind of the traditional Mayan dress, and it changes throughout the different areas of Guatemala. It's usually similar to that, but we noticed as we traveled that the shirts were different, like they were like lacy or embroidered, or so the style changes a little bit, but it's always colorful shirts and skirts. The original Mayan spirituality is polytheistic. They worship nature gods, especially the gods of sun, rain, and corn. However, a lot of this spirituality has been lost through colonization, and only 5% of the population still practice the original Mayan spirituality. Mayan people hold an importance in astronomy and astrology, for example, the Mayan calendar and Mayan zodiac signs. Mayan zodiac is far more complex than our zodiac signs or our horoscopes that we follow. Instead of basing it on just the month that you were born, it's based on like the exact day and the exact year that you were born. My sign is the Nosh, the woodpecker. Yeah. So Mayans had rituals of sacrifice. Human sacrifice was not common, but they commonly sacrificed animals, food, and materials, and practiced bloodletting among the royal people during festivals and ceremonies. According to Mayan mythology, the gods sacrificed parts of their bodies to give life to humankind, and when humans offered sacrifices, it was a sign of gratitude for that. The Mayans also built amazing pyramid-shaped temples. An example of that is Tikal, which I have a picture of later on. It's a huge tourist attraction now. And there are 23 different Mayan groups. Some of the main ones are Quiche, Quechical, Mam, Quechua, and Tzutuhil. And they all speak different languages. So there are differences among dress in the different areas, different groups. Oh, and by the way, this is from Guatemala. As you can see, it's got some beautiful flower embroidery. Oh, and I also forgot to show that this is a jade necklace, and it has my zodiac sign, the Nosh, on it. And Mayan people also believed that people should be buried with jade in their caskets, and it would prepare them for the afterlife. Mayan people are very artistic and skilled in different areas like weaving and beading and stuff like that. So here is a picture of a Mayan woman weaving. So as you can see, it's very, I don't really know how it works, even though I've watched people do it before, but it's kind of complicated, and yeah, this thing hanging from and do it. The top corner there is Tikal, the pyramids that I was talking about before, and here is what a traditional Mayan family might look like. The man here is wearing the traditional Mayan outfit, which is a cowboy hat, and as you can see, the clothing here, but Mayan men typically don't wear their traditional outfits. It's a lot more common for the women to wear their traditional outfits, but the men just wear jeans and t-shirts because their traditional outfits are very expensive and also more impractical for going to the washroom and stuff because they don't have zippers. This is the zodiac chart for 2014. So I don't know if you can see, but the different days have the different signs. Every day has a different sign. I now have a new understanding of the indigenous peoples in Guatemala and the brutal history. I'm realizing more and more that most colonization stories have similar outcomes and similar ways of getting these outcomes through violence. Reading about the Guatemalan genocide was so horrible, and it made me wonder how people can live with themselves with having such an awful history and still not having proper indigenous rights and treatment. But then I remembered that our country is not much different at all, and it was really a wake-up call and a call to action to think about reconciliation and what that will look like in my own country.